Hey everyone, Ryan here with the Start Guys, and I am excited to introduce you to someone I actually just met today. We were put in touch with one another through a mutual Facebook friend, and so today I want to introduce you to Sarah Jones. She owns a real estate company here in Denver. What's the name of the company?
It's Bamboo Realty.
Bamboo Realty. And I'm just going to ask you up front because usually I ask this at the end, but let's get this part out of the way. She's going to share a really powerful, moving, inspiring story. And so I want them to know up front, if people want to connect with you, if they have questions, or if they want to know more about this story, how can they connect with you?
Email is the easiest way to get a hold of me. It's Sarah, Sarah, and then at bambooagents.com. That's my company email, and I sit on email for too long every day, so that's the easiest.
All right, and you're open to anyone contacting you?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, guys, ask her questions. Get all the questions you want asked. So I told Sarah I'm not going to do this a traditional interview style because she's got a story, and I want her to share this story. And so I'm just going to throw it to you and start from the beginning where we talked about, and then carry us through.
All right, carry us through. So I have two children that are adopted from Ethiopia, and a question that we get all the time is, why did you choose to adopt from Ethiopia, and why not biological children? And anybody who's adopted has fielded questions that look like that. So I grew up in a family with an adopted brother and also several foster kids. So when I thought I want to be a mother, my vision of what family would look like has always been, non-traditional in that sense.
Yeah.
And always had a very special place in my heart for Ethiopia. My grandmother used to tell me about the drought that they had in the 80s and the needs of children over there. So the awareness of it and the family that I grew up in, adoption made a lot of sense for us. And there are so many kids in the world, both in the United States, internationally, who need families, and we wanted to meet that need. So we signed up for adoption. And adoption is a very long process. In our case, it took over 4 years to bring our daughter home. And then a year later, we brought our son home. But the story of bringing my son home, I think, was, it is a very powerful story because I had to, step out in a belief and do something radical really to bring him home. So that's the story that I would love to share because I think that, hope is inspiring. If you're in a long journey, whether it's adoption or something else, that maybe you'll be inspired by it. So.
And that is, just to interrupt you for a second, it's why we're calling these start stories, because it's people who are stepping out to go after the thing that's been in their heart or their gut, that impulse that you just can't get away from. And going back to what you just said, I was sharing with Sarah earlier, because we talked before this story a bit, and I was sharing with her that I just got back from Africa, and people ask all the time, why go to Africa if there's so much need here? And I was asking her if she got this question, why adopt in Africa if there's so many to adopt here? And I thought your answer was actually really profound, that this was the thing in your heart. It's not true for everyone, but you were following what was in your heart.
Right, and I think that that's the important message to take, is that if you have something that is in your heart, that resonates with your soul, and it matches with a need, then by all means pursue it. And my desires don't look the same as everybody else's. And so if somebody has a desire to, say, adopt locally or volunteer locally, by all means pursue that passion because you're matching what's on your heart with a need. So that's how I feel about it. And I feel like people sometimes get into trouble if they try to ignore it or they try to do something different than it. Like, it's on your heart for a reason.
That's it. So back to getting your son in Ethiopia. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so adoption is an extremely long process from the moment that you apply to an adoption agency and say, I would like to be a parent of a child in need. It is a lot to do. So we had already been waiting for quite some time. And even once you get a picture of your child, it's still months and sometimes years before you actually bring your child home. So for my son, we got pictures of him on October 30th of 2015 when he was 45 days old. And we knew that it would be 6, 9, or 12 months before we could bring him home. And there's not a lot you can do. The Ethiopian government has to approve the adoption. They have to reconfirm he's an orphan eligible to be adopted. And the United States government, same thing. They have to go through and make sure you're eligible to adopt, that the child you're bringing home is indeed an orphan, and that he qualifies to come to the U.S. under orphan status. And that takes a really long time. So in the process of waiting, you stare at pictures of your child, and you feel a little bit powerless, and you have to fall back on what you know. I know that.
And so let me.
Yeah.
So you know this picture. You've never met this child, but
Right.
you know this is the child.
Yep.
You are eventually going to take home.
Yep, exactly. So
Wow.
you're given pictures, and as much information as they have, which is never enough. And so the
Yeah,
information
yeah.
that we got was he's about 45 days old. This is his health condition and everything we know about him, and it fits on 3 or 4 pieces of paper. And so that's the life story of your child. So. After staring at pictures of my son for months and months, we saw the process sort of, rolling forward, never as fast as you want. And in Ethiopia, when August gets here, so does rainy season. And so there's this looming deadline of you either go to get your child before rainy season in August, or you have to wait till October. And so this season was upon us.
So don't fly to Ethiopia in August.
Yes, or bring your rain boots with you, because it is literally muddy every day. And the government all shuts down, so the courts were closed in August. And my husband and I together made a decision of, if we can't go get him before rainy season, then Sarah will fly there to meet him for the first time, love on him while you're there, and just get to know him a little bit, and then come back later to get him. So I flew over there in August. I went by myself without my husband. Another adoptive mother, she met me over there, and also to visit her son. So when we got there, something unexpected happened. They said, you can take your child out of the orphanage while you're here. And we had no idea, so we were somewhat ill prepared for that. But we took him out of the orphanage, and he got to stay with me at the guest house for 5 days. And as you can imagine, having to put your child back in an orphanage after you've had them out for 5 days is just excruciating and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And you kind of say, like, what am I going to do? And I did 2 things that day. I went straight from the orphanage, taking him back, to volunteer at a school that we were sponsoring a child at. And that was my form of distraction. Like, I can't be with my son, so I'll be with my not son, my sponsored child at the
So
school.
on the first trip, you were there 5 days? Only 5 days?
I was there for 2 weeks total, but they let us take him out for 5 days.
Okay. So you were there 2 weeks, then went home.
Then went home.
Okay.
Yeah, and putting him back in the orphanage, went to volunteer. And back at the guest house that day, I got out my calendar and I started scrolling through dates, and I just honed in on October 24th. And I said, I will be back on a plane October 24th. And for anybody who's adopted, and you know that there's just no way you can control the process, but I just knew that I would get back on the plane. So I flew home with that, in my heart, I will be back on a plane.
Which was just 2 months later.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
2 months
August to
later.
October.
Yes.
Yeah.
So October 1st, that first week of October, there was a big religious celebration in Ethiopia. And unfortunately, there was a stampede, and 1,000 people were killed. And Ethiopia is a country that has been in somewhat unrest lately, a lot of government protesting.
Yeah.
And so a stampede that was potentially caused by government security officials, I knew could be a very big deal in the stability of the country. And I was right. The country went under a state of emergency about a week after that stampede. And so here I was, in Colorado, waiting for news that I could go pick up my son, but watching a country, death spiral into a state of emergency. They declared martial law, they set a curfew, they cut off communication, phone service, internet connectivity, and we were getting nothing from our adoption agency about the security of our children. And we started hearing news reports about an orphanage that had been, ransacked by people looking for children of a certain ethnicity. And just you hear these stories and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm counting down to my October 24th get on the plane date that I knew in my heart since August that I was going to be on the plane. And the week I was supposed to travel, October 21st, the U.S. came out with one of the most strongly worded travel restrictions and recommendations, notices that I had ever read. It was like, do not go there unless you're essential staff. And the airport had been closed here and there. So,
and you said, I'm getting on the plane.
I said, I'm getting on the plane. And
that's what it means to follow your big. Find your big and follow it.
You get on the plane. And, my husband, we did a pros and cons analysis. Even though I knew I was going to get on that plane, you have to get your spouse or another person on board to see your vision too. And so we laid out the pros and cons, and there were way more cons than there were pros, right? Security, expense, he would have to be single parent to Portia, run the company while I was gone. And once we saw the very long list of cons and the very short list of pros, I asked the question, what are your top 3 most important things? And he circled 2 on the pros list and only 1 on the cons. And he sort of sat back in his chair in that moment and said, okay, I know you need to get on the plane.
Yeah.
So
let's just pause there for a moment, because I think lots of you can identify with that, resonate with that. When you're going after your big, and if you put that pros and cons list together, the cons list might be bigger, but it really does come down to the question of what's important to you and what's most important to you.
most important.
Because there may be all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't do this thing, but it's the question of what's your big
Yep.
and what's important, and then how can we make that thing happen.
Yep.
And that drives it. So
Exactly. So I think that kind of analysis of not just listing the pros and cons, but actually stepping back and saying what is the most important among this list,
Yeah.
you can sometimes make a very difficult decision crystal clear that way. And in that case, it was get on a plane. So October 24th, I got on a plane. And I flew over there. And while I was over there, I had very little communication with my family, my support network. There's an 11-hour time difference, and also limited internet connectivity. Social media was cut off. I didn't have phone service. So the communication that I had was very spotty.
Yeah.
And while I was over there, there was virtually a complete changeover in government. So I got on the plane with contacts at the Ministry of Women's Affairs and contacts at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were out. And so I had to think about how fast can I establish new contacts. And really when you're alone in that moment, you have to fall back on what you know. And I think a really good example of that, my son unfortunately had a head injury while we were there, and I spent some time with him, visiting with medical staff in a hospital over there. Did he need to have surgery? And you don't want to think about surgery in a third world country without a support system.
Yeah.
And I just, I leaned over him in the hospital bed, and I told him what I knew. I said, I know that you have a dad, and this is that he loves you, and I know you have a sister and that she loves you, and I know that we're going to get on a plane and go home. And I just fell back on that, so when you're in that hardest time, I call it my cyclone. You just really have to know that you know that you know.
Fall back on what you know.
Yeah. Fall back on what you know that you know that you know. And again, that goes back to like what's on your heart. You can't fall back on what you're faking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to know you know it. So I was there for 29 days, and we did get the letter that we needed to finalize our son's adoption. I stood in court and said I will be Biniam's mother. His name is Biniam. And the minute that I got what I need, I said, okay, now what about something for Tadios? What about something for Betania? There was 4 other kids with my agency that needed to come home, and they all flew home within a couple weeks of my being there. Yeah. And it was nothing, people were like, gosh, do you think it was a miracle? And I think it was just my heart and my knowing inside and out, and nobody could tell me otherwise. I had to be there to get it done.
Yeah. So what was that moment like when you got on the plane to go home with your baby boy?
Yeah, I'll tell you when I lost it, and I'll send you the recording so you can listen to it. But driving away from the guest house, it sort of came crashing in that I did something impossible. Right?
So you recorded this?
I recorded it in the moment, and I literally was sobbing, and it was dark outside because the flight out is at 11 at night, and I was sobbing, and I was like, I can't believe I did it. I can't believe I did it. And the feeling of being so alone and isolated for so long, but also understanding that the people that you needed to show up in the moment did show up in the moment, right?
Yeah.
But it was like a crashing in moment, and certainly one of the most emotional things that I had experienced, and I'm glad I recorded it, and I'll share it, with you because it's super powerful. But we flew home, but again, just that day, it's probably cliche, but that date with destiny of I'm putting you back into the orphanage, knowing I'm going to get back on a plane October 24th before anybody told me that I could, and before all of it went down.
Yeah.
All of the chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Sarah said, if you were listening, she referred to this as your cyclone. She told me just a few minutes ago, and I asked if she'd share it again. She has this story called, she recently did a public speaking engagement in Raleigh, North Carolina, and your talk was called, Don't Be the 15-Minute Rat.
Yes, don't be a 15-minute rat.
Share that story with us, because I think y'all are going to love it. I think you're going to resonate with it. And it's a story. I'm not even going to say what it's about. You just tell it.
So in the 1950s, there was a scientist named Kurt Richter. And the 50s, of course, was before we knew right or wrong about animal welfare. And so he was doing an experiment on animals, rats in particular. And he had a very simple scientific question. It was, how long could rats swim in a cyclone of water before they drown? Right? And again, laying aside the ethical dilemma here. And he put rats in a cyclone of water, and he started the timer, and he just watched what would happen. And they all drowned within about 15 minutes. And he set up a second experiment. And he got a new batch of rats, and he set up another cyclone of water, and he put them in. And he watched them, and he watched the timer. And right before 15 minutes came along, he scooped them all out of the water. He dried them off. He put them away. He saved them. Right? So he set up a third experiment side by side, 2 cyclones of water, and he got a brand new batch of rats that had never been in the cyclone, and then the previously saved rats side by side in their cyclones. And he set the timer. And so how long do you think that first batch of rats lasted?
Yeah.
They lasted 15 minutes. That's what was expected, right? What about the other batch of rats? How long do you think they last? 30 minutes, maybe an hour?
Yeah.
4 times as long. They actually swam for 60 hours. They literally swam for days. And the only difference was hope. And the belief that their circumstance would change if they just keep going. And so they kept on swimming in the cyclone for 60 hours. And I think it's such a powerful story that relates back to my adoption, of just having that hope and that knowing of my circumstance being in Ethiopia with all of this chaos and my son with a head injury is not for forever. And so it was waking up every morning and going to the agencies, asking for help and getting it done. And I just never wavered in that. And you just have to keep going.
And that's why it's so dangerous to lose hope. And we've all seen it. When people lose hope, it's a drown. They drown.
They
you
drown. Exactly.
And it's the power of even keeping a glimmer of hope alive, and asking the question, what does it look like for me today to go after that? Not worrying about tomorrow, but how can I set that date on the calendar and make steps today to go after that?
Exactly. And you have to make steps, because it's not hope that keeps you going. It's the action. It's the swimming while you're in the cyclone.
Yeah. So powerful. All right, guys, I think we're going to wrap it up today. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing a piece of your story. And I realize that 15 minutes, it's just a piece of your story. There's so much more. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Sarah. She gave you her email. I'll put it on the screen so you can have it. And thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Ryan.
All right, guys, we're out. We'll see you for the next one.
All
Peace.
Right.